Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to EHiN 2019. Please welcome to the stage previously General Manager of Norway and Senior Vice President of the digital health company Amra. Today, she is Program Director for Nordic Life Science Days and Strategy Developer for EHiN. Please give a warm welcome to your host, Chelsea Ranger.
Good morning. Good morning. Can you guys hear me okay? There we go. How are we doing today? Good? We had enough coffee? Yeah? Okay, good. We're about to kick off a really exciting 2 days, so I'm just going to go ahead and warn you, a little extra energy is recommended. So I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us at EHiN 2019. EHiN stands for eHealth in Norway, and this is Norway's largest conference for the digitalization of the health sector. Now, the Ministry of Health and Care Services, together with ICT Norway, founded EHiN with two common goals in mind: to foster a strong cooperation between IT and health, and to bridge the knowledge and experience between organizations and industry. So maybe you've heard this quote before: "We are here to put a ding in the universe." Now, 35 years ago, Steve Jobs said this quote when he was talking about his 1984 Macintosh. But today, putting a ding in the universe symbolizes development, both technological and societal. It's a reshaping of our yesterday, our today, and our tomorrow. But putting a ding in the universe is a quote that I also happen to live by, both personally and professionally. And it's a quote that I think is relevant to everybody sitting in this room here today. Because each idea we have, each decision we make, has an impact, makes a ding. And regardless of which sector you come from, you are sitting here today because you hope you'll make an impact on your industry, amongst your peers, and ultimately on the patients and individuals that will be best served by our willingness to make change happen. So what is our challenge? Our challenge is to remain aware of and dedicated to creating a positive societal impact, and to collaborate to better integrate industry into the public sector and IT into health. So what are you going to experience over these 2 days at EHiN that will help you to better identify how you can make change happen? Well, the obvious: you're going to have lots of great speakers. So I don't know if you guys have taken a look at the sessions and planned out your program, but some of the things that you're going to hear about include digital health innovations disrupting medical diagnostics and precision medicine, the value of health data and sharing that data with the citizen, how to implement e-health into the health sector, and what does AI really mean for the sector. Throughout the expo, and I hope you spend a little bit of time there, right? You're going to meet a lot of new solutions, from new innovative startups all the way to global companies. But it's in this room, right here, right now, that we hold a vast number of innovative and powerful minds. So sitting amongst you, you have representatives of the ministries, the municipalities, from industry, from organizations, from academia, from the IT sector, and from health. So I'm going to urge you to not only go to the sessions, right? Listen to the speakers, of course. Go to the expo. But I'm going to put a little bit of pressure here and say, take a look at the person sitting right next to you. Shake their hand. Introduce yourself. Because it is through the power of collaboration that we actually make change happen. And so this is how we positively impact the future of healthcare in Norway. And it all begins here today. So this morning I'm going to introduce a couple of speakers to you, and they're going to join me in opening EHiN. And our first speaker today is Torgeir Waterhouse. Now, Torgeir has a central role in the Norwegian debate on IT policy issues, and he's very often seen in the public sphere, so many of you already know him. He's worked at the Consumer Council, he's worked at ICT Norway, and he's recently co-founded a new firm called Åtte. He is an expert on AI, security, digital infrastructure, copyright, privacy, and a slew of other things. But today he's going to speak with you about what modern-day success requires when it comes to artificial intelligence. Please join me in welcoming Torgeir to the stage.
Thank you. Hi. Well, the first thing it requires is actually being here in the morning. So welcome. You're doing the job good so far. This is going to make us succeed. This is all about navigating the perfect storm. And of course, that's never easy. It's always difficult. And right now, that's about the combination of computing power, data, AI, and most importantly, humans, which is us, if you should be in doubt about that. And if we look at our technical history, we've been talking about Moore's law forever. Every second year, the capacity doubles, etc. But if you look back on the recent times, what we've been seeing is that is increasingly, the power has been increasing exponentially in the 3.4 months doubling time instead of 2 years, which is quite a heavy impact. And that means that since 2012, on the capacity to do AI computations, we have had a 300,000x increase instead of a 7x increase, which is quite dramatic. And that is one of the things, reasons for us being here today, talking about AI is something going on now, and then we can have a discussion later on, is it actually going on now or what? One of the most important things here is data, the sea we have of data. And the sea of data is now the big term. It used to be data is the new oil, now it's sea of data. Basically, it's the same thing. We have tons of data, not structured, highly valuable, if we figure out how to use it in the best possible way. And of course, then it becomes important to understand and discuss who's in control of this, who's in charge, who's calling the shots. What does that mean? Why are we doing what we're doing, and what are we actually trying to achieve? And how do we handle that in a setting where we're increasingly more aware of the need to have privacy and handle data anonymously? And how do these different needs actually match up? Because if we stop using data because we're afraid of the consequences for each individual, then what for society and for that individual down the line? If you remember back to the so-called Cambridge Analytica scandal, there was a hearing in the US afterwards where a young company founder called Mark had to appear in front of a bunch of old men and answer questions. And this went on for quite some time. And in Norway, it was sort of the evening and far into the night time. And in the early evening, local Norwegian time, he was answering questions saying stuff like, "We've been building tools." And he moved along during the evening to not enough to build the tools. And in the night time, Norwegian time, he said, "We need to take responsibility." And this is where it gets interesting. Who are we? What does it mean to take responsibility? And what responsibility? It's down to the humans. The issue is, though, that this is not a human. This is an AI-generated human, so-called human, an image, a representation. And when we're handling data in that way and using data to represent things, we have to make sure we know that it's actually representing in a way that secures what we need to secure. And that's basically about a few simple things, one of them being education. Are we actually educating ourselves to be able to handle this, to make the right decisions, to understand who has to be involved in the discussions? Because AI is not some IT thing handled by the IT department. It's something that affects every kind of decision-making, everyone in the decision-making hierarchy. And then we're going to automate stuff. That is part of the value here, part of the goal, the outcome. But when automating stuff, we have to understand what that actually means. Luckily, this is just an art project, Beat Tweeter. It's a ring that measures your pulse, and if your pulse stops, it tweets for you, saying, "My heart has just stopped. Goodbye to all my followers. I loved you all." Hashtag final farewell. This is probably not a good kind of automation. And then again, we get lost in debates like this. This is my favorite headline from 2018. Blockchain-based AI voice assistant brings data privacy to smart homes. The only hype word missing is sustainability. Then it would be a perfect headline. But we need to get beyond these. We need to discuss what this is really about and understand what it's really about. And then we need to get into what do we actually have when we talk about data. Data being the new oil, the sea of data. We have tons of bias. And what does bias lead to when we handle data willingly or blindly without reflection? Well, a project in the US illustrates this quite well. The system was developed to help judges assess how likely it was that criminals would reoffend. And of course, data was being used. One of the cases looked into was the comparison between these two guys. And right now, just seeing them, we start thinking what we know. Who are they? What have they done? And we can start to feel our own biases. This is their crime history. And the conclusion from the system was this. This older white guy with a long history has a low risk of reoffending. This young, darker skinned guy, has a higher risk of reoffending. How come? Where does this come from? What kind of bias is in here? Well, could be bias in regulations leading to this. Could be bias in organizations leading to this. Could be bias in technology. Could be bias in practices. Could be bias in humans. And I think one of the interesting things about this case is that it shows that we initially, at least many of us, jump to the conclusion that, well, this system was biased against the younger, dark-skinned guy, but actually that might just as well mean we're biased against older, white-skinned guys, because the system might know something we don't. We just jump to the conclusion that that's where the bias is pointing. So this is difficult, really difficult. And one of the things we have to understand and discuss is, when do we need just good data versus great data, or the best data available? And when is it good enough? What is good enough in any given context and setting? Within what time frame? During the Second World War, the US Air Force figured out they had to do something about their airplanes because they got shut down all the time. Actually a nuisance when they're trying to run a war. And one of the things they did was they said, okay, we have to look into how we add more armor to the planes. But they realized they couldn't just armor them all up because then they'd become very heavy. That would decrease the flight range, increase the fuel consumption, and make them a lot less efficient in the air. So what they did was they decided to study bullet holes and see where are the planes getting shot. Where can we have more armor to optimize? The answer to that was, of course, roughly here, which is a huge part of the plane. But also, they have another issue with this. How could they look at the bullet holes of the planes? Well, they could actually look at the planes that returned, but not the planes that got shot down, because they never returned. And then the question becomes, what is the similarities and differences between the planes that get shot down and the planes that actually return to show off their bullet holes? Well, the difference might not be that big, but still, it might be essential. So making decisions based on these bullet holes might lead to something, but not necessarily the right thing. What they had was what we call survivorship bias. The conclusion of basically saying, I do not need my seatbelt because I've never been in a car crash. Which is true. I've never been in a car crash. Why should I need the seatbelt? We need to really understand what the data put to use actually can tell us and what it can't. Which leads me to the 26th of September 1983. And I can see that some of you guys are old enough to remember where you were that day. At least know that you were somewhere. That was a very, very important day, or night. Because on that day and night, a system in the Soviet Union told the guards at watch that 5 missiles were entering into the Soviet Union airspace. Their orders, of course, would then be to retaliate. But this one guy, Stanislav Petrov, who was in charge, said, I demand visual verification. So he stood up. He fought his own urge to obey orders. He fought his crew and stood there until they could verify visually there was actually no missiles in the air. The system had triggered on something and reported falsely that there were missiles coming. He filled in the blanks in the system, in the data. And when facing all this, we need to understand, when are we giving advice that can help us avoid the dangers? Reflect on that the next time you see this sign along the roadside. What does it actually help you achieve? Will this stop the rocks from falling? Will it make you not be affected by the rocks if they hit you? No. But we keep doing this. We need to reassess how we advise, how we educate, how we analyze, and how we use data. Then, and only then, we'll be able to achieve value from this perfect storm of data and AI and humans. And are we having the right conversations? Thank you for your attention and your time.
So thank you.
Thank you.
So your thoughts are really inspiring, and I want to talk to you more. But first, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, and then we'll take that.
Will do.
Okay? So I'm proud to introduce our next speaker to you. She is a clinical academic, she's an investor, and she's a strategic visionary with global experience from successful startups to Fortune 500s. In 2019 alone, she has been named Accenture's Life Science Leader of the Year and Freshfield's Top 100 Most Influential Women. She's on a mission to bring novel, cost-effective, and simple healthcare solutions to the world while building the case for prevention, open science, and citizen genomics. Please give a large Scandinavian welcome to the Chief Commercial Officer of Genomic England, Joanne Hacket.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I must say I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, so thank you very much for the very kind welcome. I'm also extremely pleased that the previous speaker has actually done all the introduction that I need to do, so I can jump right into the heart of what I want to talk to you about today. So obviously, one of the things that I think is quite exciting currently is this whole mixture of data that's out there in the healthcare space. How do we start to put together the interesting data that makes sense to individuals? We'd heard about how there's a sea of data out there. We talk about how data is the new oil, but really, is it actually useful at all unless we actually know what it means and it gives you an answer? So one of the things that I'm involved with currently is working with Genomic England in the UK, and what we've been asked to do is try to understand whether or not there's utility in looking at whole genome sequencing, combining that with clinical data, and trying to understand whether or not this is something that should be developed and rolled out into routine clinical care. So about 6 years ago, we were asked to do a pilot project looking at 100,000 genomes, and alongside of that, collecting all of the secondary clinical data that is accumulated in the healthcare system. So I'm pleased to say, I will fast forward 5-6 years later, our pilot project was a success. We currently have over 100,000 whole genomes in our database, alongside about 3 million clinical data records. Now, the interesting thing here is not just trying to gather a whole bunch of data, it's trying to make it make sense for companies, academics, and clinicians globally. So what we've actually done is really a healthcare transformation project. And I think if I was to think about one of the ways that data actually makes sense and why we should be collecting data, it's to really catalyze change into a system, be that a healthcare environment, in the way drugs are developed, clinical trials are rolled out, or a variety of other things. So really what we've been doing is working very closely with the healthcare system, trying to understand and be as transparent as possible in all of this. We have put the participant in the heart of everything we've done. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not individuals own their own data, whether or not they know what they're consenting to, and we have tried to alleviate a lot of those issues by being as transparent as possible, highly ethical, an element of excellence running through everything we've done, and having the participant at the heart of what what we do. So all of this together has really catalyzed change in the healthcare system. Currently, if you're wondering whether or not you have a suspected rare disease or cancer, in the UK, this is delivered free at the point of care, whole genome sequencing, and as I said, the clinical data as well. So we've really tried to affect this change. So what does this really mean then? Having data is quite exciting. Having it locked away in isolation, not very exciting. How do individuals get access to it? How do you get to answer the questions that you have? And how is that actually going to be meaningful? Now, with data, we always say, oh, more is better. I agree with that in some respects. It's the quality of the data coming in and also whether or not the data that you've been capturing is going to actually answer the questions that you have. So with respect to genomics, of course, more is better. There is a lot of different individuals in this world, a lot of different ethnicities. There are a lot of different reference genomes. How do we bring them all into a database and try to get the best possible data as we can? So 100,000 genomes, we thought we were extremely doing well, thought that was a very good thing, the largest project in the world, we thought this was fantastic. And then it was decided that 100,000 is really not even a drop in the ocean. So the next big challenge was having 5 million genomic analysis in this database over the next 5 years. So this is a very ambitious project, one that we are working very closely with partners and other healthcare systems as well. So I think we will hopefully have a debate about that today as well, how we start looking at ways to federate this data. Anything to do with healthcare data cannot be done in isolation. It really needs to be done globally. So looking at different ways to collaborate, I think is extremely important as well. So let's think about having a giant database, even bigger than the one we currently have now. We currently have about 25 petabytes of data. In the healthcare system, we all think that's a huge thing. Where, however, in the banking system, for example, these are transactions that are done in minutes sometimes. So how do we start learning about the ways that we access data, make it accessible to individuals, and learn ways that other individuals in other sectors have done this effectively? So as I mentioned, we currently have quite a lot of data. We think that having this colossal data set is a very important thing. But really, at the end of the day, when you look at a graph like that, a lot of people might say, well, so what? What does this mean for me? I'm someone who studies quite a lot about transcriptomics. Is there anything in there that's helpful for me? And this is where I think it comes back to, it's not necessarily the data that you have, it's the questions that you want to answer. And a lot of people are saying, oh, you know, all of these bioinformatics and informatics individuals, they're so smart and they're in such high demand because no one knows how to interpret the data. Agreed. However, as you heard in the previous talk, how can we start being smarter about developing algorithms that can make the data make sense so that it's not relied upon a very small group of individuals? It's our duty and responsibility to be able to think of the healthcare and also educational initiatives that are quite important to be able to make this data make sense. So while there is this colossal data set, how do we actually start asking those questions about what that data really means? And then if we want to put it into actual a use case, a lot of people talk about how data shouldn't be getting into the hands of pharmaceutical companies, or they may say it shouldn't be getting into the hands of people like Google. Well, how can we actually start to interpret this data if we don't have the skills and the tools to do that? It really does need to be a sense of collaboration. But I also believe that in order to have collaborations, again, this goes back to what I said at the beginning, we need to be transparent in the way that we handle and we use data. So this is a case study, one of the companies that we work with, Alexion Pharmaceuticals. It's an American-based company. They have a lot of expertise in renal ciliopathy, so a rare disease of the kidney. So they have been granted access to our data. To get access to the data, there's a certain process that one must go through, and as I mentioned, the participants are at the heart of everything we do, so they know who's accessing their data and what they're doing. So what they were doing, they were looking in our database, trying to understand individuals with this particular disease, and they came back to us and they said, there's a group of individuals in your database, but beside the diagnosis, there's the word unknown. We would have diagnosed them with this particular ciliopathy. How come you haven't? And the answer is very simple. We don't see enough of them to know. So if we haven't seen enough of them to know and couldn't make that diagnosis, why shouldn't someone with more expertise see that and help us make that diagnosis? So they've now diagnosed at least 16 individuals in our database. So these individuals now have a diagnosis, and obviously a treatment plan has now been curated appropriately. So this is the power of sharing data, having it accessible, yet understanding the transparencies around that, the ethical imperatives around that, and the constraints around that. So hopefully we'll be able to have a little bit of a debate this morning about understanding whether or not it's more data or whether or not it's the type of data, having the question put up front, and just trying to understand a better way of curating that data and also having access to it in a way that you can actually answer that question and also collaborate. Internationally, I'm sure there are many more than 16 individuals with this particular rare disease. How can we start understanding ways to reach those individuals and making sure that if there is a clinical trial, for example, that there is equity of access? And these are all the things that I think the power of healthcare data can achieve, as long as we start thinking about the actual implications of that globally. So with that, I will thank you for your attention. I look forward to having a bit more of a discussion with you shortly, but thank you again for inviting me here this morning, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. I'll take this one. So why don't we take a seat over here? Torgeir, I'm also going to invite you back up on stage with us. All right, so we've got a few minutes, and I would like to ask you both a couple of questions. So Joanne, I'm going to start with you. In your experience, have you gotten a sense for Norway's appetite for industry and academic collaborations?
Yeah, so I think, again, I don't think, from a UK perspective, we wouldn't be sitting here at this conference today trying to have these discussions if we didn't think there was appetite. I think one of the things that we've been very impressed with is that the Scandinavian countries actually as a whole are quite keen to understand how obviously a very unique patient population can be brought into a wider database. And I think it's quite important to understand that, because as I mentioned at the very beginning, if we're looking at different ethnicities and different reference genomes, they can't all be collected from one country. So we have sensed quite an interest, and I think this again goes back to the global realization that at the end of the day, health really is wealth, and how can we tackle that together?
Yeah, I like that, health is wealth. So Torgeir, let me segue over to you. What do you think is Norway's greatest barrier to collectively working together in the data space? And I'm going to challenge you a little bit and ask you to say to us what we can do over these next 2 days to address those barriers.
Yeah, well, of course, they're easily to address, very much so, or not. I would say that the biggest issue maybe, or biggest barrier, is this idea that data and knowledge and decision-making lives in a silo that we established 100 or 130 or 150 or 40 or whatever years ago. And of course, claiming that Norway is completely divided into silos would be unfair, but that's it's a very visible issue. So getting over that, while at the same time remembering why we actually are here. And that's not only a Norway issue, but I tend to experience, and maybe I'm like that myself, I most probably are, that we are very sort of preoccupied with who's doing what and why we're doing it, and this lives in my sector and that lives in your sector, and don't come here and intervene with whatever I'm doing. And we want to sort of uphold the reasoning for what we're doing and forgetting why we started doing it. It might come to shock as people, but there's no such thing as a public body that exists for its own part. It only exists to help fuel whatever need in society. And the health sector is there for people, other people, not the sector itself. So remembering that while saying, okay, what does technology we have now, what does that do? How does that challenge the boundaries we've set up, the sectors, the silos, the responsibilities from 1950, etc. So sort of getting beyond that. And then again, if we sort of agree with my idea that is one of the biggest obstacles, that has got nothing to do with the health sector. That's got everything to do with society.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I have a question for both of you, but just to tap into this, because we spoke about this yesterday. So we were talking about FinGen, right? FinGen is an example that we've seen of a great collaboration. It's a group that you're also working with as well. Do you think that we have possibilities like we've seen with Genomics England and FinGen? Is that possible for us to build within Norway and potentially pan-Nordic?
Yeah, I would say yes, it is. If we have the willpower and the decision-making power to do it is another question.
Yeah.
But it's possible, and I'm aware that there are several projects looking into now how we can do things cross-border within the Nordic countries.
Yes.
To see how data can travel, and technically it can.
Yes.
So it's a human and legal issue.
Yep. Well, so then this last question is to both of you. Is there any advice that you would offer those of us here today who are looking to better understand the value of open data sources versus the perceived risks of working with industry? What advice would you give them?
Sure, I will go first then.
Yeah.
So on the back of obviously the case study that I just showed, I think one of the things that we have worked very hard at is trying to understand what worries people. I think a lot of people, when we think about health data, that's something that's extremely personal to us, and we don't want anyone to see it. And we don't want anyone to see it because we're unfortunately afraid that if someone finds out something about us that we don't want them to know, that there will be either a miscommunication or discrimination against that. And I'm not saying that we're going to solve this very quickly, but I do think that when we start thinking about healthcare in the current way that it's being treated, we treat sick people, which is fine if that's what the healthcare system is there for. But I think we're moving more, especially with the more data that we're able to collect, from treating sick people, and we're starting to move that dial into prevention and into wellness. And I think the more a society starts to think about a well group of individuals as opposed to a sick group of individuals needing treatment, that discrimination and that worry won't actually be there. And again, I'm not saying this is going to happen overnight, but I think we will be less worried about sharing healthcare data or allowing people to access it in a safe environment if we are not afraid of the consequences of someone knowing some of that stuff. So that is my hope, and I think that we're working towards that. But starting, I think, in the first instance of having data in an accessible area that you have to be a registered user, for example. And that's one of the ways that I think we have tried to protect our citizens' data, is that the database that we've created, you can't just log into it and download the data, for example. You have to be a registered, verified user. You go into the environment, this is industry or academia, and then when you do your analysis inside the environment, you then leave the environment. You don't take the data with you. So, and it's always always anonymized as well. So I think there are ways that we can bring the public with us, and I think that's the biggest barrier, is people not understanding what's being collected, how it's going to be used, and whether or not it'll be used against them. And I think there are ways that people are making a lot of advances in that space.
Well, so in the program in Genomics England where you're talking about so much transparency with the individual, what is the individual getting? So if industry and academia are playing in this playground and they're able to extract something and provide something of value, what information is then relayed back to the individual who provided their data?
So there's a research registry. So anyone who logs into this research environment needs to submit a research proposal. That research proposal goes through a science advisory committee, an access review committee, and on the access review committee sits participants. And then once they're granted access, that proposal that they have submitted is placed into a research registry, so you can see the work that individuals are doing. If any additional findings, so in that case study that I just showed, those individuals who were then diagnosed by industry, they give us that information and we give that back to the individual. So if there is a diagnosis or a treatment plan that is going to be changed in some way, shape, or form, it goes back to the individuals. In addition to that, they've all consented for both research and recontact. So if we need to go back to them to let them know about a clinical trial or a new drug that's on the market, we have the ability to do that as well. So it is a two-way street. Some individuals will never get anything from it, and I think that's also a very important thing to know. So there is sometimes, I think the human need to be able to want to help someone else is actually quite strong, especially when it comes to individuals being sick. So we do have that opportunity to allow people to feel as though they're digitally donating information to help the greater good.
So when you talk about the shift that we require on an individual level and a shift in our way of tackling healthcare as preventive care instead of sick care, have you seen, I mean, you've got Genomics England, you've got UK Biobank, both of which are well-structured data sources being used by a slew of academics and industry players globally. Have you actually seen that shift in mentality in the healthcare system in the UK?
So I think we're getting there. Again, these are not things that I don't think will happen in a day, a week, a month, or a year. But there's quite an interest now about looking at early detection disease cohorts. So again, trying to understand how you detect it earlier. If you can detect disease earlier, then you can obviously treat that very differently as well. And the appetite, I think, for individuals is quite high to do that. I think we're all becoming slightly more conscious of the fact that we're living longer. We don't want to just live longer and be unhealthy. We want to live longer, very fulfilling lives. So how do we start understanding the ways that to prevent getting sick in the first place? And if you do get sick, how do you make sure that the treatment is going to be correct and the right one for you?
Yeah. Torgeir, I'm going to switch back to our earlier question and relay that back to you. What advice would you give about those who are looking to better understand the value of open data sources versus the perceived risks of working with industry?
Well, I think we need to start out with asking the question, why is industry there? Because if you draw a line between the public healthcare system or sector and industry and say that it's okay to have data over here but not over here, you're doing a very I would say, awkward, backwards thinking approach to risk and to the reduction of risk. And I think in any country, any given country, you'll find in the history that's been that you haven't got this black and white or 0-1 relationship to risk and private versus public sector. So it's a lot more about which training do we need, how do we establish trust, and how do we look into what we need to do to actually make things secure and reduce risk. We tend to keep lagging behind and think physical security. People think data is secure if it's in Norway, and that this the Norwegian board is some kind of magic formula that makes data secure on the inside. It's not. It's a well-kept secret, of course, but it's not more secure in Norway. And it's all about how you handle it and how you work with it. So what we need to is talk to each other, really start understanding more of what's going on, because everything is shifting or in movement. And we need to realize that if we keep doing what we were doing previously, we will not succeed, no matter who's handling the data, be it private or public sector. And we talked about this example I tend to use about the horse carriages and the taxis, and that where it was quite almost bordering on stupid, but if you run a horse and carriage taxi company and you shift to petrol-based cars and keep purchasing hay and having people cleaning out the stables, you're not going to succeed.
Right. Yep, I like that example. So I see that our time is up, and we've had too limited time for some very big topics, but I really want to thank you both for sharing, and I have a feeling there's a lot of people who are going to be wanting to talk with you over the next 2 days. So thank you both, and I hope we get to talk about more of this privately.
Thank you.
Thank you.